Hi, welcome to our panel, which is how to best target the Nordics. Today I have three very experienced panelists with us, coming from different fields, from regulatory, from affiliation, and from sports forecasting as well. So with us today we have Tuomas Kanervala, who is from Finland. Tuomas has been running AccuStore since 2014. He's a global leader in the sports forecasting involving prediction of sports events and the athletes' performance in all types of sports. Before AccuScore, Tuomas was a successful management consultant in the fields of high-tech industries and media, and was very influential as well and worked extensively in the sports betting sector. Next is Svetlana Kaltenager, who has 10 years experience in sales and marketing. She holds a master's degree in international business and marketing. And for the past years has been working across a number of different departments and functions in the gaming companies and the gaming sector, and is currently the head of the affiliate team at Elmont Group. Last but not least is Charmaine Hogan. Probably she's the veteran of all of us here. She's been involved in gaming since 2003. So from the very beginning, she's a gambling and regulatory and policy expert. She spent 12 years in Brussels, working on gambling policy, most of that time with the EU Commission's gambling policy unit under DG Grow, and is currently the head of regulatory affairs at Playtech. I am Ruben Portanier. I am the partner of FLX and Alliance, an advisory firm specializing in the gaming sector. My past life, I'm a former CEO of the Malta Gaming Authority, and I was also part of the board of the International Association of Gaming Regulators. So that's our introduction. So let's start off immediately with our first question, and I would like to start off with Charmaine, if you don't mind, Charmaine. So let's start off with Sweden, which is, you know, the new kid on the block from the Nordics area in terms of regulation. So since Sweden re-regulated recently, it feels that, you know, gambling is the talk of town in Sweden, where you always get a lot of articles in the press, a lot of media coverage, political debates. And in fact, that has led to a number of consultations and also what they call in Sweden inquiries. The way how gambling policy develops in Sweden is yet to be seen after these consultations. It's perhaps a bit different from how other mature markets like, you know, the UK and maybe Malta have, whereby, you know, the improvements to the gambling regulation is always ongoing. So we are curious to see what these inquiries and consultations will bring forth in Sweden. Certainly there are going to be some adjustments, some restrictions, but maybe not only that. Charmaine, in your view, do you think that, first of all, what do you think is going to happen from these consultations? And secondly, do you think that these consultations will result in more restrictions, creating higher barriers to entry into the Swedish market?
Thank you, Ruben, and hello, everyone, and thank you for a very nice introduction. Yes, indeed, we are at Playtech following the consultations very actively. We have contributed to those inquiries, sharing, at least in terms of player protection and preventing gambling harm, our ongoing research and work in this area. The responsible gambling element has become very topical everywhere. And I think rightly so, as you pointed out, the so-called backlash, if you like, in Sweden has happened much earlier than in other markets like Italy, Spain, or the UK, where the regulations are that much more mature. I mean, we can have a whole discussion just on that, but essentially this is where we are now. Consultations have been launched, more than one. So I think it is difficult to say nothing more will happen. Definitely something will happen. In my view, whether you end up with high entry barriers which make the market viable or not will depend on the nature of those measures, whether they will actually be efficient ones or whether merely restrictions. And I will pick up on one of those as an example. I mean, I think we should not forget that next year we have elections in Sweden. Although in my view, that should not prevent a proper assessment of the replies that the authorities have received to those consultations. I'm sure that industry associations and various key stakeholders have provided their views, and the time should be taken to properly assess what it is the responses are, because ultimately whatever Sweden comes up with, the objective is player protection and preventing problem gambling. But what we have ended up so far is blanket measures, if you like, mandatory limits. But whether those do have the intended effect of really protecting players, I would put a big question mark on them. One element which I think will become topical, and I think it helps industry to take one element and say, let's try to be a step in and move to the forefront of debate, let's engage early on, is the risk classification of products. So you're talking about essentially game features. Now, if you look at the inquiry, Sweden has assessed or is trying to assess against certain maybe existing for a while, criteria about classification of products, where in my view, we need to move, and we should move more to looking at what are game features, those risky game features. And you can take a bit of what has been done in the UK. Industry, although pushed a bit, has led on there. Playtech did take the lead in the UK, and what you have right now is a code of conduct on game design. And in fact, the UK Gambling Commission is picking up some of those elements, and they will become mandatory in October, I believe. You have right now Spain just very recently issued a consultation. Czech Republic has carried out a review of their law, and they actually refer to the risk classification of games. So there I see a common theme forming up. And there you can say, like, listen, there's a lot of work that the industry has started doing here. Why not try to say, let's avoid new requirements each time in every jurisdiction. Let's try to engage constructively with the authorities from now. And of course, it's not just on the industry. We urge the Swedish authorities to be open to engaging, and not just the regulators, talking about the policymakers, you're talking about academia, health centers, etc. And because ultimately, what do we want? We want regulations which are based on evidence. We want regulations which are efficient in the long run. And in my view right now, in our view right now, there's been much less focus on products, so equally much less research on those features which could be risky. And I think industry can just basically be ahead and say, listen, there are product features which lend to risky play and to problematic gambling or harmful choices. So let's try to do that. At Playtech, we said we want to raise standards, and this is where we want to place ourselves. Essentially, talking about safer gambling by design, essentially. And there's where we're encouraging collaboration. And one other element, and I'll try to leave it at that, is I think in Sweden, it's a matter of how rather than if, is the introduction of B2B software licensing. Now, we can discuss the merits of that, but ultimately, I think, of course, legally, you have to justify why you want to introduce such a measure. It's got to be fit for purpose. But what we would encourage is that, you know, the market, when Sweden first opened in 2019, arguably, the framework was where the tax rate was relatively well in comparison to other jurisdictions. A broad range of products can be offered on the market, still can be offered on the market. And yet we've seen a decline in the channeling rate. What you want to avoid is introducing a measure such as B2B licensing on what we hear is on arguments of fighting of the illegal offer. But ultimately, if you end up with licensing conditions which are overly burdensome, and you don't allow for all types of software license from your nano ones to your largest suppliers to be on the market, you can then end up with certain gaps. So not to the benefit of licensed operators, not to the benefit of the Swedish players, but to the benefit, of course, to those websites who don't need to meet those requirements. And if we do want to say, listen, let's introduce something which is actually intended to protect players better. For example, you can look at accreditation for against software gambling standards, B2B or B2C. And I think that would be a measure which makes sense in this debate.
Yes, I mean, Charmaine, and I want to also involve Svetlana a bit now. Charmaine, you mentioned, you know, certain measures that were introduced from a player protection point of view. One of them was the much debated one-time only bonus restriction. However, then COVID-19 came into play, and many jurisdictions, not all, but many jurisdictions, took some steps in order to put in some player protection mechanisms because of the fact that people are locked in and they might be more exposed to losing control on gambling products. So there were certain restrictions being placed. Probably Sweden was the one of the countries that made most noise in terms of, or most debate in terms of the temporary restrictions that they included during COVID-19. So Svetlana, maybe Charmaine can just touch upon very, very briefly. So do you think that these further restrictions had a negative effect on the Swedish operators? Did they have the desired effects of player protection that the Swedish authorities were seeking? And has it actually played to the advantage of those operators that are not licensed in Sweden?
I think that Swedish operators got hit very hard with the situation. I mean, the Swedish market was already under strict supervision before COVID happened, like the infamous bonus of once in a lifetime, like you mentioned. So of course, when COVID was in its dawn, more restrictions were happening. I remember at that time I was working in operations, and we were all discussing how is this going to affect the players? How is this going to affect the business? Because all of a sudden there were talks about the deposit, maximum deposit limits, about session limits upon registering. So of course, all these factors were going to have to be taken into consideration. Now, the question is, what does it bring when too many restrictions are set in place? And we often see that players try to find a backdoor because they want to play and they want to enjoy themselves. And this is where the black market story comes into play, so to say. We have currently the German situations in front of our eyes. What happened since the 1st of July with the new regulations, with the new regulations setting the license. Basically, we have operators who are trying their best to adhere to the new regulations. We have others who decided to simply close the whole German market because it doesn't make sense for them anymore. It's not lucrative anymore. So yeah, as I'm saying, when these requirements become too strict, the player unfortunately will look for new options, and these options might not always be the best to safeguard the player. Licenses are important. However, it is always important that they make sense both for the operator and for the player. If they are too strict, unfortunately, they have the opposite effect.
Yeah, Charmaine, I mean, before you mentioned the channelization issue, and as Svetlana just touched upon it as well, what are your views? 20 seconds.
Well, no, from a purely regulatory perspective, I mean, extending temporary restrictions, in my view, is unhelpful. They are in their nature temporary, but extending them, you're making them permanent, but it creates the legal uncertainty because anybody looking at that market is going to say, is this the way of doing business in Sweden? Permanent measures then should be subject to a proper assessment to see whether they are effective. And those type of blanket measures are just treating every single player the same, whether you or not you have a problem gambling, whether you are one of those large majority which actually is enjoying the entertainment product without encountering risk. Blanket one-size-fits measures are not really the answer. And nowadays you have use of AI and machine learning, which actually allows you to target your intervention measures and to look at players individually. And one important, I think, element to this is that you've introduced those restrictions in Sweden, temporary but extendable constantly. And then at the same time, when you have the issue of bringing new products, new product variants to markets, it is not easy to engage with the regulator to bring them on the market in a timely manner. And as Svetlana basically saying, it just plays into the unlicensed sites because you have new products coming to market before they come to market in a licensed environment. That can't be helpful for sure.
So Thomas, I'm going to bring you into the picture now. I'm going to touch upon what Charmaine and Svetlana just mentioned now in their intervention regarding when you have restrictions, what effect does that have compared to going out of your jurisdiction to seek a market offering which is not regulated in your particular country. And here we have two countries that you know quite well, which are Finland and Norway, which share a common regulatory philosophy that in order to protect the public and for public health reasons and for public order reasons and to minimize gambling, the negative effects of gambling, the only way to go is down the monopoly routes. So they both share this type of philosophy. So technically, residents in Finland and Norway should not be playing on operators which are not authorized, ergo not the monopolies. And yet, Norway and Finland, when it comes to the Finnish and the Norwegian, they do tend to also seek sites which are not obviously licensed in Norway and Sweden. And they tend to be quite popular as well. In your view, do you think that Norway should and Finland should be considering some partial reopening of the market, although it seems that is not on the cards? The cards are not on the table for that particular element. And what risks do you see for those operators which are targeting Finnish and Norwegian residents, obviously not being licensed?
I think for this licensing or not licensing discussion, at least here in Finland, the new gaming law is coming in force somewhere in next year, and it's very clear that licensing is not part of the deal there. It's only monopoly Veikkaus that will run the gaming, both sports betting, casinos, and horse racing in the future as well, if the law passes. And right now it looks like that's 100% sure that it passes. So same thing as in Norway, that we have only one player in the field, but naturally, like you mentioned, and Sharma and Svetlana said earlier, there are players outside of borders of Finland, and currently it's reasonably easy for any player here in Finland to play outside. It's actually not illegal, it's only illegal to market those services within the Finnish borders, and that is then creating all kind of interesting situations, that what is then marketing and what is information sharing, for example, and how different companies are approaching this market. And a few examples, this year there are big events in sports, like for example Tokyo Olympics. TV rights are owned by Eurosport / Discovery, and those broadcasting stations are in Sweden actually, and the servers that are broadcasting the Olympics in Finland. So what happens is that 95% of all commercials during the Olympics or any sporting events in Eurosport are casinos or sports betting operators. So they have found this kind of way of operating and providing marketing through neighboring countries that are clearly targeting the Finnish players. And same thing applies for bigger affiliates, that they have set up Finnish guys, Finnish funding companies in Estonia, UK, and they are running websites that are targeted 100% for Finnish customers outside of the country. So that then limits Finnish government possibilities to shut down these operations, and usually it's quite good services, good operations, good performance for the players as well to use these sites. And I think this kind of idea that we can build a wall around us and live here happily rest of our life without any problems in gaming is a bit outdated nowadays. And the idea in Finland that we follow the Norwegian route of blocking payments to different operators outside of Finland, that is part of the consideration in the new law, is dead from the beginning, because there's always new players that find out ways to provide good payment gateways. They find the loopholes, and they serve the customer better than local monopoly.
Well, Thomas, as a supplementary question, it's a bit curious, however, that you have Finland, which has 3.5% of the EU 27 gambling revenue. It is the 6th highest in the EU 27. Denmark is the 7th highest with 3.2%. And yet they are completely different philosophies. Denmark has an open market, has been open for quite a long time. Finland is, as you described it just now. What do you think could happen? Is the fact that Finland has such a high share, although being such a small country, as Denmark is a small country as well. Do you think that it is it has the characteristics to be like another Denmark in reality?
I think there are some similar characteristics between these countries, but of course, I could say that Finland and Sweden are very, very similar in many cases. We have similar sports what we are betting. We have a trotting that is very popular in both countries and not so popular in other Scandinavian countries. So when we think about the market itself, I would say it's some kind of combination of other Scandinavian countries. There's no big difference. Ice hockey may be #1 in Finland, not so popular in Denmark. Then lotteries, casinos operating very similar ways. So I would say what works in Denmark, what works in Sweden would most definitely work in Finland, even though the political approach has been a bit different and looks to be different for near future as well. In Finland, I think the statistics are maybe tweaked by two different things. Another is that we have a quite amount of big players. So there are guys who are making a living out of this world, and they are increasing the numbers. And then this kind of problem gambling is also a big issue here in Finland, and that's, for example, one reason that gaming monopoly Veikkaus has now decreased amount of slot machines in supermarkets by 50% during last year and this year. Third biggest supermarket chain Lidl has removed all the slot machines from their shops, and they are showing the way that this is the sustainable way of making business in this area, and they try to get all the let's say problem gambling to somewhere else than their premises, because that's best way actually to get rid of and get help for these people, that they are only in Veikkaus premises where they can be monitored much better.
Svetlana, just want a very brief reply, because we're now going to start running out of time. So in Finland, we've seen that there is, there was an increase in advertising and marketing by the monopoly, and it was a bit criticized. Well, it was criticized heavily. Could it be that sort of marketing energy that the monopoly had was to try and counteract the approach that the affiliate marketing managed to infiltrate into Finland for the offshore operators? And what type of role do affiliate marketing companies have in the Finnish marketing, in the Finnish gambling sector?
Yes, as a matter of fact, Ruben, I believe that having a monopoly is already not optimal. Because just imagine going to a restaurant and having one dish on the menu and you have to pick just that. So it is obvious that when players are being faced by such a situation, they're going to look elsewhere once again. So that is one of the things to keep in mind. We try our best to protect the players. And when players look for other options, they might not be protected from aspects like AML, responsible gambling. Other options might not include deposit limits, might not include the need of KYC documents, for example. So of course, having a licensed option will safeguard the player as much as possible. probably, in fact, this approach has had the contra effect, because as we're saying, rather than keeping everything safeguarded, one tries to look for other options. And yes, you asked about marketing and the affiliation side. Yeah, of course, we do target many affiliates. They target Finland anyhow. As we all know, that since everything is online, everything is easily accessible, and this, with all the pros and cons it brings with it.
Thank you. I just need a yes or a no for this question. Starting from Thomas. Is Denmark a saturated market for new entrants?
No.
Svetlana?
No.
Charmaine?
I think right now it's not.
Yes and a no as well. Will we ever see a uniform regulatory policy across the Nordic states, starting from Thomas?
No.
Svetlana?
No.
Charmaine?
Not not pure.
So it's the no responses that win. Okay, I think we're just about in time to conclude our panel. I would like to thank Thomas from Finland, Svetlana, and Charmaine from the UK. Thank you very much, and I wish you the best of the proceedings with the next panels.